What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the Neighborhood Podcast. So for today's video, we're going to do a quick recap to the UFC 259 card this past weekend. So this card in particular was a pretty stacked card. So we had 3 title fights going into this weekend. We had a title fight in the light heavyweight division. We also had a title fight in the women's featherweight division. And then we also had a title fight in the bantamweight division. Typically, you don't see 3 title fights on cards very often. They're kind of rare. Usually what you'll see is maybe 1 or 2 title fights on some of these bigger cards, but having 3 title fights on one card is a huge deal. So we'll go over those fights. We'll also go over some of the other main card fights that we have, and then we'll also touch on some of the preliminary fights that we had this weekend, which were spectacular if you got a chance to watch them. So the first fight that we'll go over will be the light heavyweight title fight between Jan Blachowicz and Israel Adesanya. So Jan Blachowicz gets the nod here, beating Israel Adesanya in a 5-round decision. So going back into this fight, I originally thought that Israel Adesanya would be victorious against Jan in this fight, simply just because Israel Adesanya is on another level right now. He's been spectacular in his last several fights over really the span of the last 2 years. And I thought more would be the same in this fight for the light heavyweight title. But Jan was extremely impressive in this fight. I thought that Jan, the one thing with him that really stood out to me was his size compared to Israel Adesanya. Israel Adesanya had to move up from his current division, which is the middleweight division, which is at 185 pounds, and going up to light heavyweight, which is 205 pounds, is a pretty tall task. And there's one things that I noticed as soon as both of the guys got into the cage, and it really did stand out because in the last 2 rounds of the fight, Jan was able to get some takedowns on Israel Adesanya, and just the weight difference between the two of them really stood out just because Israel Adesanya couldn't get off the mat. He was basically on his back for about 3 minutes in the last 2 rounds of the fight, which really did make the difference because up until that point, it was really back and forth. Israel Adesanya definitely won some rounds in this fight, but I really think that Jan took the fight into his own hands when he was able to secure those takedowns. And to me, that was the difference in this fight. And the scorecard reflected it. I thought the scorecard was a little bit too heavily favored in Jan. I thought this was a closer fight than the scorecard made it out to be. But like I said, those 4th and 5th round takedowns for Jan were significant, and it did prove to be a major factor in Jan defending his light heavyweight title. So up next, we have the women's featherweight title fight between Amanda Nunes and Megan Anderson. And if anybody got a chance to watch this fight this past weekend, it was a really quick fight. Amanda Nunes was able to secure a submission win over Megan Anderson within 2 minutes of the fight. I remember I was watching this fight with a buddy of mine, and I made a casual joke at the time that I didn't think that Megan Anderson was going to last more than 2.5 minutes in the cage. I was only off by 30 seconds because Nunes was able to get the submission in 2 minutes and 3 seconds into the first round. Just an absolutely dominated performance from Amanda Nunes. She continues her dominance in the women's side of the UFC. She's clearly, without a doubt, the greatest women's UFC fighter that we've ever seen. And to be quite honest with you, I don't see anybody that can really go toe-to-toe with her anytime soon. She is in a class all by herself, and I think at this point, there's nobody realistically that has a shot to beat her. So the next title fight that we have on deck for you guys is the bantamweight title fight between Petr Yan and Aljamain Sterling. So this was the most controversial fight of the night because Aljamain Sterling was able to secure the title from Petr Yan after Petr Yan was disqualified for a brutal knee to Aljamain's head in the 4th round. So just to kind of give you guys a little bit of nuance to why Petr Yan was disqualified, he kneed his opponent while his opponent was on the ground. And in this case, Aljamain Sterling's knee was on the ground. And there was a little bit of misinformation that Petr Yan's corner was giving him because one of the coaches wanted Petr Yan to strike Aljamain just with punches. And somewhere it got lost in translation, and Petr Yan ended up kneeing Aljamain in the head, and it cost him his bantamweight title. And Aljamain, even though he won the title against Yan this past weekend, it didn't seem like he was too thrilled about winning the fight the way that it occurred. So it wouldn't surprise me within the next couple months or so that Peter Yan and Aljamain Sterling run this fight back. And I mean, just looking at the fight itself, it did look like Peter Yan was going to win this fight just because two out of the three judges specifically had favored Peter Yan to that point in the fight. And Peter Yan was definitely winning the fourth round, and wouldn't surprise me if Yan would have won the fifth round. It just seemed like Aljamain Sterling, his tactics were a little bit off in this game, because just looking at the fight, he really went at a frenetic pace to start off the fight. And then as the fight progressed into the later rounds, you can definitely tell that he was starting to fatigue. Peter Yan was still able to keep his composure up until the fourth round, where he levied that brutal knee that cost him his bantamweight title. So, I mean, just to kind of wrap it up, don't be surprised if we see both of these two run it back fairly soon after Aljamain recovers from his injuries from this fight. So the last two fights that we'll go over in the main card are the fights between Islam Makhachev and Drew Dober, and the fight between Thiago Santos and Alexander Rakic. We'll start with the Islam versus Drew fight. And this fight was pretty boring if you're a casual UFC fan. Islam was able to secure the win over Drew in a third round submission. And this win for Islam was very dominant simply just because of his fighting style, which is very reminiscent of Khabib Nurmagomedov's style. It's expert wrestling, expert grappling, and even some describe it as mauling, and that's essentially what took place in this fight between him and Dober this past weekend. It's an impressive win for Islam. It moves him to 19-1 in his MMA career, and with the loss for Drew, it bumps him down to 23-10 in his career. And then the fight between Thiago Santos and Alexander Rakic, this was by far the most boring fight of the night, simply because it didn't even look like these guys really even hit each other. Looking at the guys after the fight, it didn't even look like any of these guys really levied any damage against one another. But Alexander Rakic was able to get the win over Thiago Santos. This was just a fight that, to be honest with you, I made a mention of this with my buddy that I was watching it with. I could have honestly fallen asleep in the first two fights between Islam Makhachev, Drew Dober, and Thiago Santos and Alexander Rakic, and I wouldn't have missed much. These fights I really did think that these fights were going to have more fireworks, but didn't turn out to be the case. Unfortunately for these two first fights of the main card this past weekend, they were duds in my opinion, and even Dana White kind of made mention of that when he was doing his press conference after these fights had taken place for UFC 259. And then we'll just do a quick recap of the preliminary card, which had some great fights here. So the Dominic Cruz versus Casey Kenny fight, really good, solid 3-round battle between Cruz and Kenny. Dominic Cruz was able to get the win. It bumps him up to 23-3 on his career. Also, the Bantamweight fight between Kyler Phillips and Song Yudong was a great fight. Very close fight, but Kyler Phillips was able to get the win over Song. In the flyweight division, we had Askar Askarov. He was victorious over Joseph Benavidez. And then, to me, one of the most surprising fights of the night was the fight between Rogério Bontorin and Kai Kara France. Now, in this fight in particular, it looked like Bontorin was going to get the win simply because his grappling skills against Kai Kara France in the beginning of the fight were superb. However, at the end of the first round, France was able to get loose from Bontorin, and he was able to land some good strikes in and got the knockout with about 35 seconds left in the fight. Actually, I take that back. I want to say he was able to secure the knockout with like 5 to 10 seconds left in the fight. It really did seem like the entire weight of the fight completely flipped in the last 30 seconds of this fight, and Kai Kara France was able to get the knockout with about 5 to 10 seconds left in the fight. Just an impressive win from Kai Kara France. So with that said, you guys, that'll pretty much wrap it up for me. I want to thank you guys for tuning in and watching this video. If you guys like this video, please like and comment to the video. And if you guys want to support the channel in any way, shape, or form, please subscribe to the channel. Kevin and I definitely appreciate the support. Just to kind of give you guys an update for what will come later this week, Kevin and I will be recording our new podcast episode later tonight. So that'll probably be ready to go on Tuesday morning for you guys. We'll go over the NBA All-Star Game. We'll also go over the signing of Blake Griffin to the Brooklyn Nets. And then we'll also go over some NFL news if any decides to pop up within the next couple hours or so. So with that said, you guys, once again, thank you for tuning into the video, and we'll see you guys around.